The side gate of Ashmore Hall stood open by an inch, the way a gate stands open when someone forgot to latch it, and no one with authority has passed since. The man at the gate did not push through. He set his hand flat against the iron and looked at the house the way a person looks at a thing they once owned, which is not the same as the way a person looks at a thing they wish to own. There is a particular stillness to that gaze, a quality of measurement, rather than longing. As though the man is taking stock of what has changed and cataloging the differences before he decides what to do. The sky above Ashmore Hall was the color of pewter, the last of the light draining from the western tree line, and the house itself was lit at a dozen windows. Somewhere inside, supper was being set. Somewhere inside, a man who wore another man's title was sitting at another man's dining table and lifting another man's wine to his lips. And here at the gate, in a coat worn thin at the elbows and boots muddied to the ankle from 3 miles of country road, stood the man who should have been inside. His name, though no one at Ashmore Hall would speak it without difficulty for some days yet, was Edmund Ashmore. He had been gone from this house for 14 months in total, 4 spent recovering in a friend's estate in Derbyshire, his skull fractured and his body so entirely unresponsive that 3 physicians had at various points stopped expecting him to wake. The remaining 10 spent in the slow, furious work of becoming himself again. He walked with no limp now. He spoke clearly. The scar at his left temple, a thin pale seam running from the corner of his eye toward his hairline, was the only visible remainder of the carriage that had come apart on the London road in November of 1813. In most lights, you would not notice it at all. In the courtyard, a footman appeared from the servants' entrance, carrying a lantern. Edmund did not step back. He pushed the gate and walked in. "The house is not receiving visitors at this hour," the footman said. He was young, barely 18, and had almost certainly been employed after Edmund left for London. He did not know the face in front of him. He had no reason to. "I am not a visitor," Edmund said. "His Grace the Duke of Ashmore gives instructions," the footman began. "His Grace the Duke of Ashmore," Edmund said, level and quiet, "is standing in front of you." There was a silence. The footman held his lantern higher, examined the face in front of him, and made the calculation most people make when confronted with a claim that is simultaneously impossible and entirely credible. He decided on impossible. "I am sorry, sir. I must ask you to go." Edmund stood there for a moment longer. He looked up at the lit windows. He looked at the house he had grown up in, which smelled of oak smoke and river mud, and the particular cold that comes off stone buildings in Lincolnshire in the last week of October. And he did not move. He did not move because a small boy had appeared at the corner of the garden wall, and the small boy was looking at him with the frank, total recognition that children manage when adults cannot. "You came back," Thomas said. He was 7 years old, the son of Edmund's late cousin, and he had lived at Ashmore Hall since he was 3, which meant that he had known Edmund for most of his conscious life. He said it without astonishment. He said it the way one says a thing that was always going to be true. Edmund looked at the boy. Something shifted in his expression, though the shift was small and did not involve his eyes going soft or his mouth relaxing. It was more like the shift a person makes when they set something down that was heavy just for a moment before picking it up again, or, "Thomas," he said. "Yes, I came back." The governess appeared from behind the boy, a little breathless, her cloak dark and damp at the hem from the wet grass. She was not tall. She had brown hair pinned firmly beneath a plain bonnet, and the look she wore was the look of a person who had been trying to keep track of a 7-year-old at dusk and had mostly succeeded. She looked at the footman, then at the man at the gate, and her expression did not carry the footman's skepticism. It carried something more careful than that. Observation? Assessment. "Miss Calloway," the footman said. "This man claims to be the Duke of Ashmore." Wren Calloway looked at the man. She looked at the scar at his temple. She looked at Thomas, who had crossed the courtyard and taken the man's hand without any of the hesitation that children show toward strangers. She looked at the man's coat and his muddied boots and the particular quality of stillness in his face when he looked at the house, which was not the stillness of ambition, but of grief, complicated by memory. "Come inside," she said. The footman began to protest. "He is cold," she said, not unkindly, "and Thomas will not go in without him, and I cannot carry Thomas, so we are all going inside." It was not a grand entrance. It was a governess, a small boy, and a dispossessed duke filing through the side door of a house that should have been open to one of them all along, and the house did not notice, because houses do not notice such things. Only people do. That evening, in the servants' hall, where Agnes the housekeeper brought them tea and no questions, Edmund ate bread and cold meat and said very little. Thomas sat beside him and ate biscuits, and said a great deal about the dogs and the horses and the new footman who was afraid of the geese. Wren sat across from them and watched the man eat with the focused, methodical attention of someone who has not had enough for a while and is not going to remark on it. She did not know yet what his presence would cost her. She would learn that later. She had come to Ashmore Hall 6 months before, in the spring of 1814, 3 months after the late Duke's ward had been placed in the charge of the new household. The post of governess had been advertised through her father's old employer in Lincoln, and she had taken it because the alternative was to return to her father's empty house and manage the debts he had left, which were modest and legitimate and very difficult on a single woman's income. Her father had been a country solicitor. He had taught her to read contracts and balance ledgers and think before she spoke, which were not qualities the marriage market had found useful, but which Wren had found useful in almost every other context. She carried his ledger with her. It was small, leather-bound, the corners worn soft with handling, and she had continued her father's habit, writing down what she noticed. The discrepancy in the Ashmore estate accounts that she had discovered in her 3rd month, the household expenses from the summer of 1813 that did not match the receipts in the butler's day book, was recorded on page 31 in her own careful hand. She had not reported it. She had not known to whom she would report it, or whether it was her business, or whether it mattered. She had written it down, which was what her father had taught her to do with things that did not yet have a place. It had a place now. Gerald Ashmore, who had been the Duke of Ashmore for 11 months, was a man who wore the title the way some men wear borrowed coats, with an awareness of the fit that does not quite leave the shoulders. He was Edmund's twin, which meant he was Edmund's face slightly adjusted, a fraction less angular about the jaw, a fraction more polished about the mouth, the edges smoothed as though someone had taken Edmund's features and made them easier to look at. He was 34 years old. He had arrived at Ashmore Hall in December of 1813 with a physician's certificate attesting to Edmund's death on the road between Grantham and London, and he had been received as the new Duke by servants who mourned the old one and by a solicitor who had no reason to suspect a document signed by a licensed physician. The servants who had known Edmund longest were careful. Agnes had said nothing publicly. She had kept her own counsel and her own copies of certain documents because Agnes had been at Ashmore Hall for 30 years, and she had her own habits. It was in the entrance hall, on the morning after Edmund's arrival, that Wren overheard Gerald for the first time. She had come down early to speak to Agnes about Thomas's breakfast, and Gerald was in the hall with Lady Constance Druitt, who had been his closest social ally since he assumed the title, and who moved through Ashmore Hall with the quiet authority of a woman who has decided the arrangement suits her. Gerald had not heard the governess's door, which opened onto a gallery above the entrance hall. Wren stopped on the stairs. "He arrived last night," Gerald said. Agnes led him into the servants' hall. "The man who came back from the dead," Lady Constance said, and her voice carried the thing that polished voices carry when they wish to reduce something to a category. "Come to make mischief." "Not from the dead," Gerald said. He said it lightly, easily, with the practiced economy of a man who has rehearsed the line. "From Derbyshire, apparently. Some friend's estate. He has a physician's letter." A pause. "So do I." Wren stood on the stairs and looked at the wall and did not move for the count of 30. Then she went down. That afternoon, Edmund was housed in the old gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden, at Agnes's arrangement, and, according to Agnes, at the suggestion of a certain member of the household staff who had pointed out that a man making a claim of succession could not make it from the road. The cottage was spare and cold, and smelled of damp stone, but it had a hearth, and Edmund lit it without complaint. Thomas found it by the following morning. "You cannot come here every day," Edmund told him, on the second morning, standing at the cottage door with a cup of coffee Agnes had sent. He was not unkind. He was simply precise. "It is not safe for you to be seen coming here." "It is perfectly safe," Thomas said. "Agnes said so." "Agnes is not the Duke," Edmund said, and the word cost him something, the way a word costs a person when its rightness is not in question, but its location is wrong. "Go back to the house, Thomas." Thomas went back to the house. He came back the following morning with Wren, because Thomas had discovered that Miss Calloway was harder to deflect than he was, and that adults were more likely to argue with one another than with a 7-year-old who was simply present. Wren came into the cottage and set a basket on the table and began unpacking it. Bread and cold chicken, and a jar of preserved plums that Thomas had taken from the larder with the full knowledge and tacit approval of the kitchen maid. She unpacked it without ceremony, and Edmund watched her with an expression that was not precisely warm, but was not the expression he wore in the courtyard either. "You will lose your post," he said. "Possibly," she said. She set the plums down. "He will dismiss you." "That is his prerogative," she said, "if he is in fact the Duke." There was a silence. Edmund looked at her in a way she had not yet learned to interpret, which was the way he looked at things that surprised him. A quality of recalibration rather than reaction. "You do not think he is," he said. "I think," she said carefully, setting out the bread, "that the accounts do not match." She did not say more than that, and he did not ask. She noticed the scar at his temple, which she could see clearly now in the morning light from the cottage's one south-facing window. It was not new. It had had months to become what it was, pale and settled into the skin. She did not ask about it. She finished unpacking the basket, told Thomas to eat something before the preserves, and left. She was halfway through the kitchen garden when she became aware that she had walked past the gate to the main path without taking it. She stopped, looked at the gate behind her, and then looked at the path ahead, which led back around to the side entrance of the house through the kitchen garden's far wall. Both paths arrived at the same destination. She had taken the longer one without deciding to. She stood there for a moment with the empty basket over her arm. The late October air carried the smell of turned earth and cold stone and the particular damp that comes off ground that will not see the sun again until spring. She was aware, with a precision she did not welcome, of exactly which window in the cottage was visible from where she stood. Her hand, walking back through the kitchen garden, was not quite steady at the wrist. She pressed it against her side and did not look at it. It was the following week that Gerald called her to the study. She had known, from the moment she heard his voice in the entrance hall, that a summons would come. She had prepared herself for it the way her father had taught her to prepare for a difficult meeting. She had read the relevant documents. She had reviewed her own notes. She had decided in advance what she was not willing to do. Gerald sat at the desk that should have been Edmund's desk and looked like Edmund at a slight remove, the way a copy looks like its original when you have not seen the original for some time. He was not unpleasant. He spoke to her with the careful consideration a man gives to a staff member he wishes to manage rather than command. He set a document on the desk. Wren read it. It was a statement in formal legal language asserting that the man currently housed in the gamekeeper's cottage had approached the signatory, Miss Wren Calloway, governess, in an unsolicited and distressing manner, claiming an identity she had no reason to credit, and that his presence on the grounds was a source of concern for the household and for her charge. It was dated to the previous day. It was waiting for her signature. She set it back on the desk. "No," she said. Gerald looked at her. "The man in the cottage," she said, "has not approached me in any manner I would describe as unsolicited or distressing. I sought him out. I brought him food. I brought Thomas, because Thomas would have gone alone if I had not." She paused. "I will not sign this." Gerald's expression did not change. He said with the same careful pleasantness, "I think you may not understand the position you are in, Miss Calloway." "I understand it," she said. She picked up her father's ledger, which she had brought without being certain she would use it, and set it on the desk beside his document. "I also understand that the household accounts for the quarter ending June 1813 show a discrepancy of £42 between the receipts and the entry in the daybook. I do not know what it means. I have not spoken of it to anyone." She looked at him. "I will not sign." She did not know that Edmund was in the corridor. She did not know that Agnes had sent him to the house on a different matter and that he had come down the back passage and stopped outside the study door, which was not quite closed, and that he had stood there in the hall and heard every word. She did not look for approval. She did not look toward the door. She looked at Gerald, who said nothing, and she took her ledger from the desk and left the room. In the corridor, she did not permit herself to hurry. She walked at the pace she always walked, which was not slow, but was not the pace of someone who had just done something that could not be undone. She did not feel afraid, which surprised her. She felt the thing she had felt when her father had died and left the debts, which was the particular steadiness that comes when the worst possibility has been named, and turns out to be smaller than the fear of it. She had refused. She had done so in Gerald's own language, the language of documents and evidence, and the formal record. She had done so without anger, which was what mattered. Anger, her father had said, is the thing a solicitor cannot afford in a difficult room, because it gives the other party something to address rather than the argument itself. She thought about this as she crossed the landing to the back stairs. She thought about page 31 of the ledger in her hand. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, about a man standing at a side gate in the dark with mud on his boots, looking at a house the way you look at something you once owned. Edmund stepped back into the passage. He stood with his shoulders against the wall and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And then he looked at his hands. And then he was still in the way that was his particular quality of stillness, the way of a man who is measuring rather than feeling, except that this time the measurement was of something he had not expected to find in a gamekeeper's cottage at the edge of a kitchen garden. What he had not expected was a woman who looked at a document designed to end her livelihood and set it back on the desk and said no, not because she had power or position or any protection at all, but because her father had taught her to look at the numbers, and the numbers did not lie. He had been in that passage for perhaps 3 minutes before she had entered the study. He had come to retrieve a letter Agnes had set aside for him, A letter from Mr. Peel acknowledging the claim and requesting documentation. The first procedural acknowledgement that the matter was real and not simply a difficulty to be managed. He had come in through the scullery door, which Agnes had left unlocked for him, and he had heard Gerald's voice before he had intended to be anywhere near Gerald's voice, and he had stopped. He had not stopped because he expected the governess to refuse. He had stopped because he did not know what she would do, which was the honest reason, and because he was still, even after 14 months of knowing better, a man who made the mistake of hoping. He had heard her read. He had heard the particular silence of a person reading something they find offensive, which is a different silence from ordinary reading, a silence with a quality of friction to it. Then he had heard her set the document down. He did not follow her. He stood in the passage for another minute, with his back against the wall and the letter from Mr. Peel in his coat pocket, and he thought about what he had heard for a long time before he went back to the cottage. That evening he came to the library, where Wren had taken herself after supper, because the library was the one room in the house where Gerald's presence had not yet settled. It still smelled like Edmund's books, Agnes said, camphor and old bindings and the cedar that came from the chest where the estate maps were kept. Edmund closed the door behind him. He sat down across from her at the reading table. He set something on the wood between them. It was a miniature, painted in the style of 20 years before, oval and framed in a thin gilt border. Two boys, perhaps 14 years old, facing the same direction, their profiles almost identical. The difference between them was slight and intimate. One had a watchfulness that the other did not, a slight narrowing about the eyes as if he were listening for something just outside the frame. I do not know when he decided, Edmund said. He said it quietly. He said it in the manner of a man who has had months to find the words and is still not certain they are the right ones. Not because he did not know the sentence, but because the thing it described was not a fact he had finished understanding. She looked at the miniature. She understood what it cost him to show it to her, not because he told her, but because she could see it in the quality of his silence, which was not the silence of a man withholding emotion. It was the silence of a man who had loved his brother the way you love the person in a household who sees you clearly, who was also the person who had presented a death certificate bearing his name and moved into his house and sat at his dining table for 11 months, and who had not, even now, sent him a letter. They were the same age, she said, which was not a question. To the minute, Edmund said. There was a long pause. He picked up the miniature and held it in his palm without looking at it. She opened her ledger to page 31 and set it on the table in front of him. She pointed to the entry, the date, the figure. £42. Receipts against daybook. The quarter ending June 1813. Edmund looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked up at her. That is not my handwriting, he said, on the receipt. If you are still watching this story, leave a thought in the comments about the moment that stayed with you. The best ones always do. She recorded his response in the ledger, quietly, after he had gone. She did not know why. She had her father's instinct for the written account, the thing that exists when all other evidence is gone. The following night, Gerald called a dinner. It was not a large gathering. Lady Constance, Mr. Peel the solicitor, and 4 neighboring families, enough to constitute a witness set without the theatricality of a larger occasion. Gerald had managed his social calendar the way he managed everything, with efficiency and a calculation that looked, on the surface, like ease. Edmund was not invited. He sat in the cottage and knew what was happening. Wren was asked to attend supper with Thomas, in the capacity of governess. which placed her at the far end of the table where staff sat when young wards were present. She took her seat. She kept her ledger in her apron pocket. She did not touch it. Midway through the main course, Gerald spoke. He produced a document from the inside of his coat. He set it on the table in front of Mr. Peel, who received it with the careful neutrality of a solicitor at a dinner, which is to say, with every expression except the one he was actually having. The document was a physician's statement. It attested that a man calling himself Edmund Ashmore had appeared at the Derbyshire estate of a Sir Matthew Crane in December of 1813, claiming to have survived a carriage accident, and that the attending physician there had certified the patient not as the Duke of Ashmore, but as an unknown traveler whose identity could not be verified. The signature was legible. The date was plausible. Mr. Peel read it carefully. Edmund, Gerald explained to the table, was a troubled man. He was perhaps confused. He had perhaps convinced himself of an identity that had more to do with wish than with fact. This was not cruelty. It was something Gerald said he had agonized over in the month since Edmund's reappearance, and if it sounded agonized, that was because it was in the manner of a performance so long rehearsed that the performer has almost come to believe it. Lady Constance said, in the tone of a woman confirming what she had always known, "A madman who claims to come back from the dead." She said it to the table at large, to no one, and therefore to everyone, her fan resting against the back of her hand in the measured way of a woman who has held that particular posture for 30 years. It is a mercy he is housed on the grounds, rather than turned away entirely. Wren sat very still at the end of the table. Then Gerald looked at her. He asked her, in the same measured tone, in front of Mr. Peel and Lady Constance and the 4 neighboring families, and the 2 footmen at the sideboard, to confirm for the table that the man in the cottage had approached her in the manner described in the document she had declined to sign. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about her ledger in her pocket. She thought about a 7-year-old crossing a courtyard without hesitation and taking a man's hand. "No," she said. The silence at the table was the silence of 8 people calculating what they had just heard. Gerald said, quietly, and without any change in the pleasantness of his voice, that her services were no longer required at Ashmore Hall. She was to have her things ready by morning. Agnes, late that night, came to Wren's room with a candle. She did not say much. She set down a cup of tea, and she said, "You are not the first person in this house to refuse him." She paused. "And Sir Horace Finch, on his way out this evening, told his coachman that the ghost came back from the dead again last night, knocking at the tradesman's entrance." She said it flatly, without heat, simply reporting the world. "I thought you should know that is what they are calling him." Wren sat at the window after Agnes left and looked at the kitchen garden, which was dark. The gamekeeper's cottage was visible from here as a faint amber line at the edge of the beds, the light of a single candle behind a shutter. She did not know if Edmund could see the house from there. She thought probably he could. She thought about Thomas, who had been taken upstairs by a maid at Gerald's instruction before the dinner reached its conclusion, and who did not yet know she was leaving. She thought about this with the focused, methodical attention she brought to problems that had no immediate solution, cataloging the specific weight of each item before setting it aside. Thomas would be given a new governess. Thomas would manage. He was 7 years old and resilient, and had already lost more than a governess. She told herself this with precision and did not let the thought go past precision. She opened the ledger to page 31 and sat with it in her lap for a long time, the household accounts from June 1813 visible in her own careful hand by the last of the candlelight. The numbers did not change. They did not need to. They were what they were, whether or not she was present to observe them. Then she turned to the back of the ledger. where there were still blank pages. And she began to write. She wrote down everything she had observed. The date. Edmund arrived at the side gate. The manner of Thomas's recognition. The character of Gerald's request. The exact wording of the document she had refused to sign. The figure in the estate accounts. Edmund's identification of the handwriting on the receipt. She wrote it in the voice her father had used, the voice of a witness rather than a party. Which is the voice you use when you want what you have written to outlast the circumstances in which it was written. In the morning, she put the ledger in her pocket, set her box at the door, and went downstairs. Mr. Peel had come early. He was in the dining room with Gerald and Lady Constance and the 4 neighboring guests who had stayed the night, and he was in the process of receiving Gerald's documentation of succession in the formal manner, which required witnesses, and took perhaps 40 minutes, and could not easily be interrupted once begun. Wren came in through the dining room door. She was still in her traveling cloak. Her box was upstairs. She had not had breakfast. Gerald looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, because he had been managing her for some time, and had not entirely expected her to be manageable, but which was close enough to surprise to tell Wren that she had calculated correctly. She crossed to where Mr. Peel was seated, and she set the ledger on the table in front of him. She opened it to page 31. "Mr. Peel," she said, "the household accounts for the quarter ending June 1813 show a discrepancy of £42 between receipts and daybook. The handwriting on the receipts is not the handwriting of the man you know as the Duke of Ashmore. I observed both sets of documents at close range. I can direct you to the comparative examples." She turned to the back of the ledger. "I have also recorded my observations of the man who arrived at Ashmore Hall 6 days ago. His manner, the responses of the household staff who knew the former Duke, and the response of the ward Thomas, who is 7 years old, and has lived at this estate since he was 3, and who walked across the courtyard and took the man's hand without hesitation or instruction." She looked at Mr. Peel. Then she looked at the room. "This man is the Duke of Ashmore. I witnessed it." It was 11 words, delivered without theater, to a dining room that had gone quiet enough that the fire in the grate was audible. Edmund was standing in the doorway. She had not looked at him. She had been looking at Mr. Peel because Mr. Peel was the person who mattered legally, as her father had always said. You address the person with the authority to act. She heard Thomas before she saw him. Thomas came through the door past Edmund's hip and went directly to Wren's side, and he took her hand, and he looked at Gerald across the table with the frank, total certainty of a child who does not understand why everyone else is confused about a thing that is perfectly clear. Mr. Peel said, carefully, that he would require the letter from the physician at Derbyshire, the original, before he could proceed. Agnes set it on the table. She had kept her own copy, as she had kept her own copies of certain documents for 30 years, because Agnes had been at Ashmore Hall long enough to understand that houses sometimes require a witness who works quietly and says nothing until the correct moment. The letter was dated December 1813, signed by the physician who had treated Edmund at Sir Matthew Crane's estate, and it identified its patient specifically, by name, by physical description, including a distinctive scar at the left temple, and by the contents of his coat pocket at the time of admission. A signet ring bearing the Ashmore crest, and a folded letter from the Lincolnshire estate agent. Gerald's composure did not shatter. It did not even crack, precisely. It softened, the way a thing softens when the structure holding its shape is withdrawn, and what was left was a man of 34 years old sitting at a dining table in his brother's house, looking at his brother, and finding that the sentence he had been rehearsing for 11 months had entirely left him. Lady Constance's fan was still in her hand. She did not move it. Mr. Peel asked Edmund to take a seat at the head of the table, He said it in the voice of a man doing his job, which was the most useful voice in the room at that moment, because it required nothing from anyone except compliance. And compliance, in that silence, was the one thing everyone was capable of. Edmund crossed the room. He did not look at Gerald. He looked at Wren, briefly, before he sat, which was the look of a man filing something in a permanent place rather than a temporary one. He sat down. 3 weeks later, on the first Thursday of November, the first snow came to Lincolnshire. Edmund was restored. Mr. Peel had completed the formal confirmation of succession on the Tuesday following the dinner, with documents sent to London by the Wednesday's post. Gerald had left for the family's lesser property in Norfolk the same afternoon. Quietly, without incident, in a carriage that Edmund had directed to be made available, because it was cold, and the roads were long, and the dispute was over. Lady Constance had returned to her own establishment in Nottinghamshire. The neighboring families had gone home. The hall was quiet in the way it is quiet after a thing has resolved, which is a different quality of quiet from ordinary silence. It is the quiet of a house that is becoming itself again. Wren had stayed. This had happened in 3 stages. The first stage was Edmund telling Agnes that Miss Calloway's position was reinstated on the grounds that Thomas required continuity of care. The second stage was Edmund finding Wren in the library 3 days after the dinner and sitting down across from her at the reading table and saying, without preamble, that he would like her to stay in a capacity that was not precisely the one she had come for, and that he recognized this was an unusual request, and that she was under no obligation to accept it, and that he was making it because he did not know how to say the thing he meant more plainly. The third stage was Wren, who had thought about it for the count of perhaps 3 seconds, saying that she would stay. She was not certain at the time what she had agreed to. She was certain that she had decided it without hesitation, which was not the manner she usually brought to decisions, and that her hand was not quite steady at the wrist afterward. On the Thursday, she was in the morning room with Thomas, who was engaged in a drawing of considerable ambition involving 3 dogs and what appeared to be a dragon, when Edmund came in from the east corridor. He sat down at the table across from them. He looked at Thomas's drawing without comment, which Thomas took as approval. Outside the window, the snow was falling in the unhurried, steady manner of early-season snow, the kind that does not accumulate quickly, but does not stop. The grounds were beginning to lighten at the edges. The kitchen garden, visible through the south window, had gone white across the beds. Edmund reached across the table and set the miniature portrait down. He set it near Thomas, who looked at it with the frank appraisal children give to objects that have been given to them by adults, and said with some certainty that the one on the left looked like Edmund, and the one on the right did not look like anyone Thomas knew. "You may keep it," Edmund said. Thomas examined it for another moment, and then placed it carefully beside his dragon drawing in the manner of a child who does not understand the weight of a thing, but treats it carefully regardless, because someone of importance gave it to him, and that is what you do with such things. Wren watched him do this and said nothing. She thought about what it had cost Edmund to set it down. After a while, Edmund looked at her. "The night you brought me in from the gate," he said. "You did not know who I was." "No," she said. "You had nothing to gain from it." "No," she said again. He looked at her in the way he looked at things that required accurate measurement. She had come to know that look in 3 weeks, which was not a long time to come to know a thing, except that it was, when the thing was clearly legible if you looked. "Why did you trust me?" he said. She reached into her pocket and took out her father's ledger. She set it on the table between them. She did not open it. "My father taught me to look at the numbers," she said. When the numbers tell you a thing is wrong, you write it down and you wait. When they tell you a thing is true, you say so. She looked at him. The numbers were true. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her, in the way he had looked at the house from the side gate, not with longing, but with the careful measurement of a man taking stock, adding the specific contents of this moment to a private account he intended to keep. She looked back at him. She was not uncertain. She had not been uncertain since the corridor outside Gerald's study. Perhaps longer than that. Perhaps since the morning in the kitchen garden when she had walked past the gate without deciding to. She had simply not had the occasion to say so. And she was not, by nature or by her father's training, a person who spoke a thing before the occasion was correct. Thomas's pencil scratched across the page. The fire settled in the grate with a small sound. Then Edmund reached across the table, past the open ledger, past the miniature portrait that Thomas had moved to make room for the dragon, and he set his hand over hers, where it rested on the table's edge. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The morning room was warm. The snow outside the window did not stop.